There are not many horror manga or any similar genres that know exactly how to draw the reader into an atmosphere filled with anxiety and psychological discomfort. Stories that present any form of antagonism and an essence filled with hopelessness and relentlessness, like in Dragonhead, leave me completely mesmerized because they remind me of how small we can be in the face of situations that escape our control. The story of Dragonhead begins in a routine calmness that soon turns into a sudden and unprecedented chaos. This is even more intense because I chose to read the manga completely blind, knowing absolutely nothing about what would happen. All I had was the name of the author, from whom I had already read another work, and I think it was this lack of information that made everything even more intense for me. If I had to summarize what the manga is in one word, I would say survival, but hopelessness would also define it well. Everything starts in a cliched manner, as seen in other similar stories. We have a bullet train full of students going on a school trip when suddenly something happens, the train derails, and hell begins. Only 3 teenagers survive this tragedy: Teru, the protagonist, Ako, and Nobuo. These 3 characters show us different perspectives on the extent of what happened. Terror begins as our eyes to what happens inside the tunnel, but tragically, and ironically, after waking from the impact, he is faced with absolute darkness. This is one of the most recurring themes in the manga. Teru is engulfed not only in mental confusion but also physical confusion in the dark. He doesn't know what happened, and even though he wants to think about his dead classmates, he only has time to try to stay alive in the chaos. Teru feels fear and is lost. He shouts, hoping for a response, but no one answers. The idea of being the only one alive in that situation doesn't calm him. Only when he grabs the lighter from his teacher's clothes does he finally see what the darkness wanted to keep away from his view: a true horror of bodies, destruction, and blood. He screams again, unable to accept the condition he has been placed in by a fate that proves anyone can be extremely powerless in the right circumstances. His survival instinct fortunately stays by his side, and all he wants is to get out as soon as possible. When Terra goes through rubble and bodies, one of the most crushing panels in the work, in my opinion, is when Terra is partially outside the train window. Amidst all the darkness, the light of a lighter visually amplifies how he is engulfed not only by shadows but also by a deafening silence, because all he hears are his screams calling out to whoever might be in the same situation. Despite knowing he will get help if he returns to the tunnel entrance, something strange is that he can't see even a beam of light from the outside. Terra finds a flashlight from one of the compartments, and in a flicker of hope, he tells himself he will get out of this, but when he runs to the exit, the place seems to stretch beyond the normal size of the tunnel, almost as if the darkness is pulling him back. This feeling, however, is quickly understood when he sees that no light is coming from outside because both passages were blocked by the collapse caused by the earthquake. The claustrophobic sensation is immense, and beyond the absurd heat, he fears that the rest of the tunnel's ceiling will collapse on top of him. Terra goes back into the train to get a radio because he wants to know if people are aware of what happened, but it is then that his panic only increases. He hears in the broadcast that a state of emergency has been declared and people are evacuating en masse, meaning getting out of the tunnel would mean dealing with another phase of the nightmare that has become that day. Teru almost lets hope overtake him and begins to think about his troubled relationship with his family. The regret of not having acted differently weighs on his shoulders. By sheer coincidence, he finds Ako, a girl who was unconscious, whom he promises to do everything to save, and Nobuo, a boy who was constantly bullied at school. This detail is even highlighted within his art because, unlike Teru, who deals with fear, Nobuo feels superior to those who died because he sees that even though he was constantly mistreated, he was the one who managed to turn things around by being alive. When I mentioned that the experience within the tunnel is seen from different angles, I was specifically thinking of this character. Nobuo gradually becomes almost like his aggressors when he feels there is no escape, and it is through him that we get the first sign of individualism. When Tara drops his flashlight, he quickly grabs it and says that now the object belongs to him, making us think that in a situation like this, the will to stay alive can force us to do anything. Nobuo's transformation begins primarily with the refusal to accept that this is where he will die. Eventually, time starts to drag on, and he tells Tara that they are not alone because there is a creature observing their despair. Tara tries to rely on the fact that he is just letting his imagination run wild, but there is no mental support to protect him from thinking that maybe Nobuo is telling the truth. Tara gets scared, and any noise in the train starts to remind him of the monster that hypothetically uses the darkness as its campaign. This mental torture is so great that Nobuo decides to embrace the fear to rid himself of it. In a fit of reckoning with his past, he finds the corpses of his aggressors and abuses them. After the violation, he is completely covered in blood and exhilarated by what he has just done. Akio wakes up and becomes aware of everything that has happened, but her relationship with Nobuo is as distant as Tara's with her, as Nobuo acts insensitively and completely strangely, accepting what happened to them as a divine gift, leading them into repeated conflicts. The first clue we have about what is happening outside occurs when Tara remembers that just before the train entered the tunnel, he saw a huge dark cloud covering everything, and from within it, a column of fire burst from an explosion and seemed to rise. Although they had time to consider many possibilities about what this dark cloud might be, they first needed to figure out how to survive inside because the heat was increasing more and more, even for the standards of a completely blocked tunnel. This terrible condition drained them of any remaining physical and mental strength. The wear and tear was great enough to even deprive them of the will to speak to each other. All they could do was satisfy themselves with the little water they had, the spoiled food, and the luck of having some help, but 4 days had passed. The tremor that derailed the train continued on a smaller scale as the days went by, but it didn't lessen their fear that everything could collapse in an instant. Taro even says to himself, completely shaken, that he would have preferred to have died like the others because then he wouldn't have to go through this torture. A week later, Nobuo further succumbs to madness by thinking they need to evolve in that place to survive. He paints his body with strange blood patterns, lives among the corpses without any problem, and even abuses Akio when she enters the train searching for supplies, making him the perfect example of someone who experienced a rapid decline in sanity due to the impossibility of immediate rescue. Meanwhile, Tara finds a ventilation duct that might supposedly take them out of the confinement. Despite fearing that he might be crushed if any tremor occurs while he is crawling, he presses on because there is no other option. The problem is that his fears come true, and he ends up experiencing the horrifying ordeal of being buried alive. The manga gradually shows different layers of pure terror within this reality that crushes the characters mercilessly. One example I remember when I think about this happens when Taro, while still alive, dreams of darkness. Not even in the world of possibilities that was his dream could he escape the tunnel, which makes him wake up with a great feeling of hopelessness. I find it truly amazing how the author subtly uses narrative and visual elements to fuel this oppressive atmosphere that explores human fragility. The unpredictability throughout this disaster is what scares the characters the most because there is nothing more terrifying than knowing that what is bad could get worse. Paranoia only increases throughout the pages because, besides losing all sense of time, they do not know if the accident was an isolated event or part of a larger catastrophe due to what they heard on the radio and the dark cloud Tara saw in the sky. Eventually, Tara manages to exit the ventilation duct and ends up in a sewage treatment station connected to the tunnel. Due to some events, he separates from Nobuo and goes with AKO to a world that is no longer the same. The sky is completely gray, and there is only darkness. The author uses this dirty and noxious setting to bring mystery about the possibility of there being any survivors. The two occasionally see mysterious silhouettes in the distance that give the impression that these figures know more about what is happening than they do. The communication means are no longer useful, and answers are out of reach. The desperation to leave the tunnel and find themselves in another puts AKO in a state of shock, making her stare at the television static for hours because she wants to believe that someone will eventually appear and explain what is happening. From this point on, we see the characters traversing a lifeless world that tries to put them on the same wavelength. They feel hunger, fear, pain, cold, and sleep. The only solace they have is silence, and even that is bothersome. But as they have nothing left, they must continue, despite wanting to be near other people, whether for safety or to find answers. They discover that in a world like this, morality is challenged by the struggle for survival. These dilemmas are seen multiple times in the manga, and they explore the darker aspects of the characters' personalities, showing that human values can easily be corroded when civilization collapses. Even more so, not as terrifying as this. This aspect is discussed mainly within the context of the darkness that is always pursuing them. However, it is used more broadly. We first see a physical darkness when the train accident occurs, and then a psychological darkness reflected in the characters. The monster that Nobu and Tara saw inside the tunnel was nothing more than the personification of their fears. The author also uses this element to intensify the unknown. Teru and AKO don't know what happened to the world, and the constant ashes covering the ground and sky can also be seen as a clear metaphor for their ignorance. The events in Dragon Head are of unimaginable proportions. Teru and AKO experience the worst that life can offer firsthand. There were moments when I felt trapped in this endless darkness because there was always another problem after one was solved. I believe the author intended to create this claustrophobic discomfort, using the world as a suffocating place. The manga doesn't provide much relief for the characters or the readers. If you're expecting an ending where the sun will shine and everything will be okay, I'm sorry to say that it doesn't happen. In a way, the shadows prevail. The central question of what really happened is also not exactly answered. The characters find various clues, and it's up to the reader to believe what they want because the manga has an open ending. All we know is that Japan likely collapsed after some nuclear weapons exploded underground, causing the mountains to erupt. But the opposite could also have happened, triggering the explosion that Tara saw in the sky before entering the tunnel. Dragon Head surprised me by effectively capturing that sense of despair as the world ends. Teru and AKO become each other's reason to live, and they end up having to settle for finding some shred of happiness in their horrible days that seem to last for years, as it's no longer possible to believe that things will return to how they once were. There were some aspects that didn't please me as much, but I believe this was due to the work being cancelled, which, for many, resulted in an unsatisfying ending because we don't know what ultimately happened to the two. Despite this, I constantly felt uncomfortable due to the characters experiencing endless unrest. Of course, I'm not saying that the suffering itself is what I enjoy in a story, but rather the ability to find in a fictional world this palpable darkness that makes the characters seem like small ants compared to the entire disaster. This journey through dark tunnels that Dragon Head offers truly takes us to very grim places, evoking a sense of helplessness that continues indefinitely. The world is falling apart, and all you can do is be a mere spectator. I hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to like, comment on what you thought of the work, subscribe to our channel, and suggest another manga that you think is worth reading. Anyway, see you next time, and we'll meet in the next video.